Welcome to my presentation. Today I will be presenting practical guidelines on creating accessible digital products. My name is Christiana Unaez. I am a user experience designer and accessibility advocate. I have been in the tech/design field for over 12 years. And during that time, I have worked with small businesses, I've worked with enterprise organizations, I've worked with higher education institutions, and currently I am working for a US government agency, and our main business is disseminating health and public health information to the public. So as a federal agency, we have to make sure that all of the content that we put out online adheres to very strict accessibility guidelines and regulations. And so on a day-to-day basis, I can work on a variety of multimedia content, e-learning courses, as well as documents and websites as well, making sure that they adhere to accessibility guidelines. I also work along with a dev team, and I do quite a bit of accessibility testing and evaluation as well. And in addition to all of that, I also oftentimes will help with training workshops on web accessibility. So today, I will briefly talk about what web accessibility is. I will also talk about why you should design and code web accessibility in mind. I will talk about the different kinds of disabilities and how people with disabilities use the web with different assistive technologies. Then I will talk about the web content accessibility guidelines and its various levels of compliance and various tools and resources that you can use for web accessibility testing. So, as we all know, the internet is everywhere. We use the web to access people and information all over the globe at a moment's notice. And so access to the web has radically changed the way that we access, consume, and understand information. And then with the pandemic, once the pandemic happened, everyone literally had to be online. And there was a great reliance on the web for a lot of our day-to-day activities, from work to learning, shopping, and much more. And so can you imagine what your life would be like if every time you try to use the web, you have these barriers that make it almost impossible for you to do so? So basically, web accessibility, it is the inclusive practice of making sure that there are no barriers that prevent people with disabilities, including visual, motor, auditory, speech, or cognitive disabilities, from accessing the web. So having a website or app or digital product that has poor web accessibility presents a lot of barriers to people. So you always want to make sure that your digital content, your apps, and your websites are accessible to everyone, because it opens it up to a wider audience. Now, one thing I want everyone to know is that web accessibility is not a state. It's not something that you get to. It's a constant process. It involves a process, and that is constantly evolving because the technology that we use on a day-to-day basis is constantly evolving. Humans are very dynamic, and so you want to design and code for a diverse set of users who interact with your product. Our experience and our interactions with the web rely heavily on what we can see, what we can hear, what we can touch. So making the assumption that all of those senses are at their full capacity at all times makes it very easy to ignore a large number of users. So you want to embrace accessibility guidelines the same way you would embrace coding constraints or design guidelines, because they help you to create more accessible products for a wider range of people. Now, oftentimes when people think of disabilities, they often think of permanent conditions, like people who are blind or people who are deaf, you know. But you may not realize that at some point in your life, almost everyone experiences some form of limitation or accessibility. You might not think about it, but there are permanent disabilities, there are temporary disabilities, and situational disabilities as well. So now, how many people here have ever watched a video in a loud place? I know I'm not the only one. You know, or how many times have you been in a Zoom meeting and you are watching a video on your phone and you don't want anyone to hear the audio? That's me every day. You know, so in that moment, at that time, you are experiencing what some people might experience every day. You know, so that's something to think of. So if you think about it like that, you will realize that it affects everyone at some point in our lives. So the reason for saying that is because when you're able to solve a problem for a group of people who have permanent disability, you are extending that solution to everyone else. You know, so by designing for someone with a permanent disability, people with situational disabilities will also benefit. Now, in the United States, approximately 26,000 people a year suffer from physical disabilities where, you know, they are not able to use like their upper limbs. Now, when you add people who have temporary and situational disabilities, that number grows to over 20 million people. You know, so your resulting accessible designs actually benefit a large number of people. Also, about 1 in 5 people experience some form of disability on a daily basis. That is roughly about 20% of the population. So if you do not consider accessibility in your when creating your apps and your websites, or, you know, you are ignoring about 20% of your potential audience. Also, accessible apps and websites benefit from better SEO results. They also encourage better coding practices, and you have faster download times as well, and reduced legal risk. Now, I'll take a moment here, because you might not realize, if your app or website is tied to a physical location, you have some kind of business or anything that has a physical presence. If federal employees use your product or your app or website in any way, shape, or form, if you receive government funding of any kind, and if your business is only accessible through the web, you are legally required to make sure that your product is accessible to people with disabilities. Now, if you don't think that's real, imagine Harvard University, one of the top universities in the country, recently got sued by students because their online courses were not accessible, and they lost. And then, another one we can all relate to is Beyonce. Her company recently got sued because a blind user was not able to use her website. So, so just to recap, it's very important to remove these barriers that, disabled people, people with disabilities might experience when trying to utilize your product. Because at the basic level, it removes barriers, for a lot of people. So if you incorporate accessibility guidelines into your already existing, product pipeline of, creating, coding, and testing, you will be able to create more accessible products. So disabilities take on various forms, including different sensory, cognitive, and physical forms. They include visual disabilities for people who are blind or have little light perception, and also color blindness. You have people who have hearing disabilities who might be deaf or hard of hearing. People with physical disabilities, that includes loss of limbs or temporary situations like holding a baby or your arm is in a cast, or people who have cognitive and learning disabilities, including memory loss, ADHD, and difficulty focusing. So you might wonder, in situations like that, how are they able to utilize the web? How are they able to utilize digital products? That is where assistive technology comes in. Assistive technology is basically any device, software, or equipment that helps people to work around their challenges. It enables them to perform tasks that they maybe have difficulty or unable to accomplish on their own. So things like screen readers or specialized glasses for people with, color blindness, or specialized keyboards, use of audio and transcription tools, and voice apps, things like Alexa. You might not think about it, but these are all assistive technology. So in creating content or in creating digital products for people with accessibilities, there are guidelines that exist to, help you along the way. So that is where the web content accessibility guidelines come in. And so they are basically a series of internationally recognized standards for improving web accessibility. It is primarily for like web content developers, designers, or people who need a standard for web accessibility, including mobile accessibility as well. Now, these guidelines have four main principles, the first one of which is perceivable. It means that this principle basically relates to how people utilize their senses when browsing the web. So some of your users may have difficulty with one of their senses and have to rely on assistive technology, to browse the web. So usually this revolves around sight, sound, and touch. So these principles within the guidelines primarily relate to the senses of sight, sound, and touch. The next principle is, here we go, is operable. That means that operable relates to the actions that people take when they are browsing the web. And this principle covers the different ways in which people browse the web. Someone who has motor difficulties might use a keyboard only to navigate because they are not able to use a mouse. Some people with sight impairments prefer to use a keyboard only. And then the next principle is understandable. That means that your website should use language that is clear and simple to understand. So you want to make sure that your website functions in a way that avoids unusual and unexpected or inconsistent functions. And finally, we have robust. That means that your website or app should make it easy for assistive technology to be able to access it. That means that, screen readers within, your app's screen readers should be able to access your digital product without any issues. So that means you should be using, standardized and recognized coding practices, clean HTML, and oftentimes the different frameworks that you utilize for coding would have accessibility tools and features incorporated within it. So you want to make sure that you are not blocking these out or that your code is not disabling any of this functionality. And so a simple way to remember all of this is the acronym POUR, like to pour water. So that's, perceivable, operable, robust, and understandable. And these make up the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So now these guidelines have three main levels. They are level A, AA, and AAA. At the level A is the most basic. So at the very least, if you have, video content, you are required to have captions. And level AA is usually the most common level that most businesses or most things try to strive for because it deals with the most common barriers for disabled users. So if you have like video, that means you should have, or if you have like live audio, you should have captions and have a transcript as well. And then level AAA is the highest and most complex level, which sometimes it can be difficult to attain this level because it is the strictest level. So in a situation where you have video, this level will require you to have everything else like captions and transcript, and then have sign language interpretation as well. So as you can imagine, that can be difficult to attain, in certain situations. So when all of that comes together, how do you now apply all these guidelines to your product? So I would like to start with, accessibility guidelines for visual disabilities. When dealing with complete blindness, as we know, the internet is very visual. Apps are, very visual. So visual accessibility accounts for a large part of accessibility guidelines. Excuse me. So when you want to make sure that your apps are accessible to screen readers, because screen readers, people who rely solely on screen readers to access the web will have difficulty with your product if it's poorly structured. So if you have poor structured HTML, that is problematic, as well as inaccessible imagery and non-text elements. As we all know, the use of images is a quick way to convey information. And then you have non-text elements, which also include graphs and charts or image maps and things like that. So ensuring that all of these elements are appropriately titled, make use of alt text. Alt text can be read by screen users aloud. So you want to make sure that when you have alt text, it is appropriately describing what the user is not able to see. So having an image and saying, image of dog, or, is not very helpful, So go into a little bit more detail with, your use of alt text instead of just, putting a few words because it's just, a requirement. Try to describe what people can actually, see in the image. And then another thing is alt text is able to be indexed by search engines. So that also allows your imagery to be found by users on the web as well. Then we have people who have low vision and color blindness. And, color is used for almost everything that we see online. But at the same time, not everyone can perceive the full range of color. You have a lot of people who are not able to perceive the full range of color. So it's a little unfortunate that we have some issues with the color, I guess, on the, you see what I'm saying? If I was relying solely on the color here, but there is supposed to be a green apple, a yellow apple, and a red apple, which now looks like blue. But a lot of people have red-green deficiencies, so they're not able to perceive those, that full range of color. So for someone who is colorblind, the image at the bottom shows, what they will see. So there is not that wide range of color, within the imagery. And then for someone who's experiencing color deficiency, with the image on the left, you will see a different number, within that. And so that just goes to show that not everyone can experience a full range of color. Now, why do I say that? Because it is very important that you do not rely on color alone to relay important information. You always want to use a combination of text, color, or graphical objects as well. Color is nice to look at, but people should still be able to understand all of your information if all of the color in the imagery is removed. Now, with the web, color is not only limited to images. You have color within navigation links, headings, and tables. So if all of that color is removed, you want to make sure that the information is still understandable. So one thing I encourage, developers to do, and not just developers, but people who are creating content, you always want to test your product in grayscale, so that if there is no color at all, is your user still able to understand what they're supposed to do, the actions that they're supposed to take, is all of that information still conveyed appropriately? And then next up, we have color contrast. So how often have you tried to use your phone and it's like bright sunlight outside and you can barely see your screen? That's all of us. So when you are creating or when you are testing, you want to make sure that there is a good amount of contrast in your text with the foreground and with the background. And this is especially critical for mobile devices. So the WCAG guidelines requires a contrast ratio of 4 to 5 and 3 to 1 for large text. Now, one thing you can always do is utilize contrast checkers. There are plenty of contrast checkers available for free online, and there are also browser extensions as well that you can use to check your contrast on your app or on your website. Then next up, we have accessibility for hearing disabilities. And once again, raise your hand if you have, and I think I mentioned this earlier, if you have ever tried to watch a video while you're in a meeting. You're not supposed to be watching a video, and you are grateful that the video you're watching has captions so you can mute your audio. So Captions are a very important part of accessibility. Although they were originally intended for people who cannot access audio but can view the content, we can all agree that they are beneficial to everyone. And so basically they provide a textual representation of the spoken words, in your video. Now, captions can either be open or closed. Closed captions can be turned on and off, like you have on, YouTube videos, or open, meaning that they are, visible at all times. So with multimedia and video content, you always want to make sure that your user has the option to stop or exit the content at any time. And this is especially important for animations or embedded video and ads as well. You also want to avoid autoplay at all costs, because how often do you have your browser open, you have multiple tabs open, and say you're in the middle of a Zoom meeting and you're presenting, and then all of a sudden there's audio coming from nowhere and you're trying to figure out which one of these tabs has the audio that's playing. So you always want to make sure that your video content or do not automatically just start playing. It should be user controlled so that they can start and stop and pause the multimedia content at any time that they choose to. And then next up we have text transcripts. So for things like podcasts, it's very important to have text transcripts, because if a user is not able to watch the video, or they're not able to focus on the video content, they have the ability to read the text and to be able to follow along with what is being discussed. This is especially useful for hearing and visual disabilities, as well as those with cognitive disabilities who might find it difficult to watch video content. Also, text transcripts are able to be read aloud, by screen readers, and text transcripts are also searchable and able to be indexed online. And then we have various input methods, because not everyone is able to use a mouse, so you want to make sure that you have different input methods available. This includes things like touch activation, voice recognition as well. So you always also want to make sure that whatever is active on the screen, there is some kind of visual indicator to allow the user to see, what is active, or, at the time, so that they're able to determine what component that they are interacting with. So elements that have a keyboard focus should have a visual border, or at least have different states that allows the user to know, if something is active or not. So a quick test that you can do is to use your tab key to navigate through a page to see, if you can tell at any given time what component that you are interacting with. And then we have cognitive and learning disabilities. They impact how people process information. So sometimes people deal with memory loss, or have difficulty focusing, or have difficulty problem solving and comprehension, things like ADHD or dyslexia. So you always want to make sure that the information is being presented in a way that is easily digestible and easy to read. You also want to make sure that you give users enough time to take action that you need them to, or give some kind of error or warning messages or alerts, to the user. And then an important part of accessibility is accessibility testing. You always want to make sure that you are testing your apps or your websites or digital contents that you are creating. There are manual and automated testing methods with various tools. User testing is really key. If you can test with, actual users, if you have specialized product or software, testing with actual users, is always key. So these are things that you should already be doing anyway. So incorporating accessibility testing within your current process will make it much easier for you. So one of the main things we have is use of screen readers. There are multiple screen readers that are available online with JAWS, I think, is the most popular one. It is a paid software, but NVDA is for Windows, and it is free. So you can install that and use that to test as well. Apple and iOS devices have Apple VoiceOver as well. And then there are different other tools, including magnifiers as well. And then there are also additional accessibility checker tools that you can utilize with Wave by WebAIM is one of the big ones out there. You enter a URL and it lists your errors and warnings and accessibility features that are found on your page. It's also available as a browser extension, and it's very good for a quick initial accessibility audit. And SiteSort is another one. It is a desktop and web app that it will also show you like broken links if you have, cross-browser compatibility as well. It also shows like different error warnings so that you can help prioritize what you're going to fix. So here is the Wave tool by WebAIM. So as you can see, it will quickly scan your page and give you, different, it will list out, the different things that that it finds wrong. And then when you click on them, it goes into more detail, allowing you to, see what the impact is. And then it can also be used to test mobile devices, as well. Now, we live in a time where smart devices and mobile phones are a huge part of our lives. With the amount of apps that are available in the Apple Store and the Google Store, this lets you know just the extent of how people utilize different apps on a day-to-day basis. So you want to consider mobile accessibility testing as part of your process. The same guidelines that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the same things apply to mobile devices as well. There is no different set of rules for mobile devices. There might be things, additional things that you might need to consider, like making sure, your zoom or magnification tools, are not disabled. Things like target size and your screen sizes and, prioritizing what information is shown to the user, because of the small amount of your screen size. So those are very mobile specific, but the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines still apply, in the same way. And the Wave tool that I mentioned earlier, you can also use that to test mobile devices as well. So I hope I didn't bore you to death. I'm hoping that this is only a small fraction of what web accessibility entails. But I just want to encourage you that you make web accessibility a part of your current workflow process. You know, for every content that is provided, think of if, you know, someone who is experiencing difficulty or, you know, someone who has a disability, how would they access that information? You know, if you have a video, you know, presented and someone can't see the video, how else can they experience that? Or if you have audio and someone who can't hear or is not able to listen to the audio, how can they still get that same information? So basically, you want to make sure that you have alternate ways available for that someone is able to experience the content or your digital product. You always want to have different alternatives available to make sure that you're, you know, that you're presenting or providing accessible options. So, you know, think of the different guidelines or the different things that I mentioned. Always, you know, testing is a big part of it. You also want to make sure that you have consistent layout and navigation. If you have mobile devices or, you know, desktop. So, you know, the same guidelines, you know, apply. And I hope that this will encourage you to research more into web accessibility and how you can incorporate, you know, these different guidelines into your existing processes to create more accessible content or accessible products. And that is the end of my presentation. So. Thank you. So if there are any questions, sure.
I work in the federal space too, and we do the web, but we're also internal facing as far as accessibility for staff and because they have accessibility needs. Microsoft is really good, and I don't mean to name drop, but they're really good about PowerPoint and Word and providing checkers for that. But the tools that you just mentioned, can they be used for like PowerPoint and Word or any word processor or, you know?
Like I know Word has its own accessibility tools that you can utilize. And there are also guidelines that are available. I've actually done training for like how to make Word documents more accessible. PowerPoints and Excel is hard because it's tables, but the different softwares, they do have accessibility tools provided within them, like Word and PowerPoint, because I have to train people on, you know, making PowerPoint and PDFs, you know, more accessible. So those tools do have, they do have accessibility tools within them already, because Microsoft is pretty good, you know, with accessibility tools. So, but they have tools within the software themselves to help you make sure that those things are, that your documents and stuff are accessible.
So the WCAG guidelines, do they work for hard copies? Like, can you follow those for that, or is there another standard?
You can follow the same guidelines for, you know, like, you know, products, but for like Word documents and stuff. But there are just some additional, I guess, tips or different things that you can follow specifically for Word documents, and then it will walk you through like how to actually do it within the document, so that you don't necessarily need, you know, outside tools to do so. You're welcome. Are there any other questions? Something you're curious about or would like to know more about? Sure. Mm-hmm.
For like blind people who use like a screen reader, would it be best to have like, instead of just an icon, to have like text under that and stuff like that?
Yeah, you always saw the one of the guidelines with like icons or like imagery is you have a way, if you don't want the screen reader to say it out loud, or if it's not something that is relevant to what is being displayed, you can mark it as a decorative item. So if you do that, then the screen reader would not read it out loud. So instead of saying, you know, like when you have like a home icon or a link icon, it would say, link or, link to home, So, but appropriately labeling it, if it's something that's relevant that the user has to know, making sure that it's appropriately labeled goes a long way. Sure, you're welcome. Anyone else?
Yeah, it's like I was curious, how's the accessibility work on, sometimes like you go to a website that fashion like very intensive, they're not the normal site, they go trying to apply all those fancy graphics and so on, or sometimes videos. So is that like are they accountable for accessibility?
Everyone is accountable. Yeah. But yeah, they are still required legally to make sure that their content is accessible. So in situations like that, that will really be make sure that the developers are following specific, like I guess different coding practices, but they all the web content accessibility guidelines is very detailed. It's like hundreds of pages long, and so they go into different sections that, relate to like your images or your video or, different interactions and, what you should be doing too. So what I mentioned is only just a small fraction. So in situations like that where you have like specialized imagery and things like that, there are still guidelines to guide you to make sure that, your content is accessible. Does that answer the question? Yeah, sure.
I came late, so I missed the workflow part, but do you have any tips about how to work with QA for testing accessibility?
Working with QA for accessibility and testing, is that what was that?
Yeah, because I think we're thinking the developers would write out what they should be expecting, but QA would be doing everything that engineers were doing. Mm-hmm. Is the idea like they test different browsers and different screens?
Yeah, so in that, because I know the way we work, we have a group of people who specifically deal with testing, right? And so oftentimes you would come up with like a testing plan, and they would have to, or using like the different guidelines, they would have to test to make sure that they all adhere to the rules. So I think if like you're working within like a group setting, or it should be part of your it should be part of the QA testing plan. That should be incorporated. It's not like it shouldn't be different. It should be part of the QA test plan. But a lot of people don't realize that, so they don't necessarily test for accessibility, but it really should be the best way to have long-term effects is to incorporate, the testing, accessibility testing into what you are already doing. So if you have QAs who are testing, for different things, accessibility testing should be incorporated into that.
So like probably all browsers, mobile, and
you should be doing cross-browser compatibility testing. You should also be doing mobile testing as well. You're welcome. Mm-hmm.
Like, do you think like should graphic designer be like more intensive about accessibility? Because like sometimes just they go, oh, it looks good, and then they have no concept of accessibility. Not all of them, but.
And I think that, to me, that is part of the issue, because I feel like accessibility is everyone's responsibility. It should not just be the QA people or just the developers. It should be everyone's responsibility. Yeah, like a trickle-down effect. So if you are a graphic designer and you're creating things, you should make sure that what you're creating has enough contrast of your colors and things like that, so that when it goes to the next step, when it gets to the developers, then they also check, make sure that what they're doing is not counteracting, or eliminating previous solutions. So it really should be a multi-step process. So everyone really should be responsible for accessibility, not just only one group of people. It would be great if accessibility is taught, within, the different practices, for designers, for developers, project managers, so that everyone knows, you're checking for different things or for similar things, at all the different stages. Yes.
I think one of the other problems is for a designer is when you have a company that has a strong brand, and then the branding police tell you you have to follow these brands. But what they don't do is give you an alternate brand that has the right contrast, right? Because you have to get their permission to actually tweak.
That is true. That is true. So in that situation, when it comes to, branding is a whole different thing. But when it comes to branding, so what you or as the branding people should be doing is making sure that, the colors or the different things that they're using, adhere or, are able to be perceived by, different people. That's not something that's always taken into consideration, but could lead into issues down the line. So that's really on the company to make sure that their branding colors, are appropriate. Yes.
Do most of the legal consequences from this happen from like individual suits, like the Beyonce example, or is there like I hate to say hotline, but like, is there any?
So usually there could be individual, or you can have class action lawsuits. Also, the Americans with Disability Act also covers, the rights of people with disabilities. So when people with disabilities have issues with your product or, with your website, there's like different processes that you can, go through to report, all of that. So there's websites, there's government websites that you can go in and enter complaints, and things like that. And then if the government gets, continuous complaints by, different people, they will come after you. So not necessarily individuals all the time. The government, can also come after you. I mean, we as a federal agency almost got sued by a senator. So it's not just individuals. The government can also come after you on behalf of, people as well. Is there anything else? That's it. Well, thank you everyone for attending my talk today.